They say knowledge is power. But what if the most powerful knowledge in the world isn't shared, it's hidden? There is a place, real, physical, and heavily guarded, where centuries of human history, spiritual insight, and possibly reality-altering information have been sealed off from the public eye. This isn't a fantasy. It's not a legend. It's a building that exists in the center of Rome, surrounded by high walls and deeper mysteries, the Vatican Apostolic Library. Now, when you hear the word library, you might picture rows of dusty books, maybe a quiet reading room, old scholars lost in thought. But this place isn't open to the curious. You can't just walk in, browse, or even know what's really on the shelves. That's where the shock begins, because this library is not a place for people. It's a vault of secrets, and perhaps a carefully locked cage for truths that could shake the foundations of everything we believe. Officially, the Vatican Library was founded in 1475. But that's only the beginning of its story, not the beginning of its collection. Many believe it holds scrolls, codices, and parchments that date back thousands of years, some from the dawn of Christianity, others from even older civilizations whose knowledge challenges the historical timeline we've been taught. But here's the catch: you can't read them. Even most clergy and Vatican employees are never allowed inside the restricted areas. The general public? Forget it. Entry requires an elite level of trust, years of academic credentials, and even then, the access is controlled. You're given permission to view only specific documents, often digitized, not the originals, and always under watch. For many, this secrecy is astonishing. Why would an institution built on faith, service, and truth hold such a tight grip on its history? The Church often claims the restrictions are to protect delicate texts from physical damage. But isn't knowledge meant to be shared, not locked away? Isn't it more damaging to keep truth buried than to risk someone reading it? This is where the feeling of cold detachment creeps in. Because the more you dig, the more the Vatican's handling of its archives doesn't feel protective, it feels possessive. It feels like a global institution is saying, "We get to decide what you know." And that revelation isn't just shocking, it's alienating. It suggests that you, the seeker, are not worthy of knowing. That only a few elites deserve access to our shared history. That kind of intellectual gatekeeping breeds more than curiosity. It breeds distrust. And that's the point where surprise turns into something colder, something harder to ignore. The indifference of institutions toward public understanding. The quiet rejection of transparency. For centuries, religions have told us to seek the truth, to question, to reflect. But when those same institutions withhold the deepest truths they've found, what are we supposed to believe? Let's be clear, the idea that the Vatican Library holds controversial documents isn't a fringe conspiracy. Even respected scholars who have entered its outer halls admit they're shown only what's been deemed appropriate. It's like being given a puzzle with the centerpieces missing. You know there's something more. You can feel it. And what if that more includes lost teachings of Jesus? Early Gnostic writings that tell a different story of salvation, not one of obedience, but of inner power? What if there are ancient records of civilizations with knowledge far beyond what we believe they could have achieved? What if the idea of angels and divine visitations described in Scripture were actually misunderstood encounters with something else entirely? These aren't just questions for theologians or historians. They're questions for every human being who's ever wondered, where did we come from? What are we capable of? And who's deciding what we're allowed to know? Because when the doors to knowledge are locked, someone's holding the key. Imagine standing at the edge of a vast ocean of truth, able to see it, sense it, almost hear the waves lapping at the shore, but being told you're not allowed to enter. That is the silent pain of every truth seeker who's looked toward the Vatican archives and been met with a closed door. It's not just the mystery that hurts, it's the intentional silence. Many scholars, theologians, and even spiritual leaders have spent decades trying to understand what lies beneath those marble floors and locked gates. Some have devoted their entire lives to studying fragments of history, knowing full well the complete story may be resting just out of reach, buried in the secret chambers of the Vatican Library. And for what? Why the walls? Why the silence? That question doesn't just spark curiosity, it stirs something deeper. A quiet frustration. A discouragement that digs into the soul. Because it suggests that humanity's greatest collective asset, knowledge, has become the property of a select few. And the rest of us? We're left in the dark, like children being told, "You're not ready." But we are ready. We have been. For centuries. The sadness becomes even more profound when we consider the possibility that much of what's hidden may include lost spiritual wisdom, messages from Jesus, Mary Magdalene, or the early Christian communities that were deliberately excluded from the Bible. Not because they were false, but because they were inconvenient. This isn't just theoretical. Take the case of the Gospel of Thomas, discovered in the Nag Hammadi texts in Egypt in 1945. In it, Jesus is not portrayed as a figure to worship blindly, but as a guide pointing inward, teaching that the divine lives within us, that the kingdom of heaven is not in the sky, but inside each person. These are powerful ideas, liberating ideas, but they are absent from the canonized Bible. It's a question that leads to anger. Not rage, but a deep-seated outrage. The kind that grows when you realize that truths capable of transforming how we live and see the world may have been deliberately removed to maintain control. And that's not speculation, it's historical fact. In 325 AD, during the Council of Nicaea, powerful men gathered to determine which Gospels would be considered official. Others were labeled heretical and were ordered to be destroyed. This was not just an act of religious curation, it was a political move to establish a unified doctrine. A power play disguised as spiritual protection. We lost so much in that moment. The disappointment runs deep, especially when we think about what could have been. If those ancient teachings had remained in circulation, if the Gnostic texts, the mystical scriptures, and the esoteric traditions hadn't been buried, perhaps humanity's spiritual evolution would look very different today. Perhaps we would not be locked into systems that emphasize obedience over awakening, guilt over growth. That loss isn't just historical, it's personal, because hidden within those pages that sit in silence beneath the Vatican, may lie the very answers to questions that have haunted every human heart. Why are we here? What are we made of? What is the divine really? And what's even more painful is knowing we may never be allowed to know. Many researchers who've tried to dig too deep into these mysteries have faced professional exile. They've been cut off from funding, blacklisted, or branded as conspiracy theorists, not because their findings were wrong, but because they were getting too close. That's not just academic censorship. That's control. That's fear. Fear of what? Maybe that if we knew the truth, we'd no longer need the institutions that claim to guide us. Maybe we'd realize that spirituality isn't something we receive from others, it's something we awaken within ourselves. That's the regret. That for generations, this awakening has been delayed, held back, hidden. And the most heartbreaking part? It didn't have to be this way. Now imagine the opposite of silence. Imagine what it would feel like if everything that had been locked away, those dusty, forgotten scrolls and censored texts, were suddenly revealed to the world. Imagine the joy, the awakening, the sense of finally being whole. Because this isn't just about secrecy. It's about potential. If even a fraction of the rumors are true, if the Vatican archives truly contain teachings of Jesus that emphasize personal power, direct connection to the divine, or ancient knowledge that reveals the universe as a field of energy and intention, then unlocking them could change everything. And not in a terrifying way. In a joyful one. You see, we've been raised to believe that religion is about following rules, attending services, and deferring to authority. But what if it was never supposed to be that way? What if the original message of Jesus and other spiritual teachers across time was not about obedience, but about empowerment? There's a childlike wonder in that thought. Imagine learning that the divine doesn't live in some distant heaven but breathes within you, right now. Imagine realizing that your consciousness isn't a byproduct of your body, but a radiant part of something infinite. Imagine discovering that the power to heal, grow, and connect spiritually has always been yours, and that the only thing separating you from it was forgotten knowledge. The emotional lift of that realization would be immense. Like a weight lifted. Like sunlight pouring into a room that had been dark for centuries. And here's the surprising twist. Fragments of that light have already made their way back into our world. In the last century, several hidden texts have been recovered, unearthed from the deserts of Egypt, the vaults of monasteries, or old private collections. Take the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, for example. It presents her not as a background character in Jesus' story, but as someone who understood his teachings on a mystical level. A partner in truth. A teacher in her own right. That single shift changes the entire narrative of early Christianity and gives us a glimpse into what was lost when history was rewritten to fit institutional power. Then there's the Gospel of Judas, where Judas is not a traitor but the one disciple who truly understood Jesus' mission. He didn't betray his teacher, he fulfilled his destiny knowingly and with love. What kind of story have we been living under if this version was never told? These recovered voices open up a floodgate of wonder and renewed excitement. They show us that early spiritual traditions were far richer, more diverse, and more mystical than what made it into the standard Bible. They weren't fixated on sin and punishment. They were alive with transformation, energy, consciousness, and inner light. And the thought that even more of this knowledge could be sitting, right now, behind the stone walls of the Vatican is both thrilling and tragic. Because it's not just about history. It's about what that history could do for us today. If we had access to the full spectrum of teachings from ancient times, from Jesus, from Mary, from early mystics, maybe depression wouldn't feel so dark. Maybe we'd find deeper purpose. Maybe prayer wouldn't be about asking someone in the sky for help, but activating the divinity within us. What would that world look like? People waking up in the morning not wondering if they're good enough, but knowing they are sacred. People raising children not just to behave, but to become who they were born to be. People connecting across belief systems, realizing that the core truth of all spiritual paths is unity. That's the joy that has been hidden. Not rules, not dogma, but light. And it's still waiting. There's something deeply exciting about the idea that we are standing at the edge of rediscovery. That we don't need to invent new truths, we just need to reclaim what was lost. The wonder is already within us. And the lost wisdom locked behind Vatican walls could be the match that lights the fire again. What happens when mystery turns into motion? When wonder becomes momentum? That's the feeling of uncovering hidden truth, not as a passive revelation, but as an active spark that ignites something deep inside. The Vatican archives may be sealed shut, but the mere possibility of what's inside has already awakened something powerful in people around the world. Curiosity is rising. Questions are multiplying. And with them comes a wave of renewed spiritual energy. This is not the energy of fear or rebellion. It's the joy of discovery. The thrill of reconnecting with something that was always meant to be ours. Imagine generations of spiritual traditions, Eastern, Western, indigenous, braided together in texts so ancient they predate formal religion. Imagine teachings about energy, consciousness, and the sacred geometry of the soul, preserved through coded symbols and hidden metaphors. Now imagine those very scrolls resting on shelves beneath the Vatican, shielded not by fragility, but by fear. Not because the world isn't ready, but because institutions aren't ready to let go. And yet, here we are, awakening anyway. Because truth can't be locked up forever. No gate, no authority, no archive can stop the vibration that truth carries. When people sense that something has been hidden from them, especially something sacred, they don't fall into despair. They rise. They ask. They search. And most of all, they imagine. And that imagination becomes fuel. We've already seen the beginning of this. In recent decades, everyday people, not just scholars or mystics, have begun exploring ancient spiritual paths that once would have been condemned. Yoga, meditation, breathwork, energy healing, astrology, and sacred geometry are no longer niche practices. They're becoming mainstream again. Not because they're trendy, but because something deep within us remembers. We're remembering. And that memory is exciting. It's thrilling. It's like finding a long-lost map to a part of yourself you forgot existed. A hidden room in your soul suddenly unlocked. Think of it. If the teachings of Jesus and other spiritual masters were truly about inner transformation, not obedience, if they spoke of the body as a temple of energy, the soul as a beacon of divine light, and reality as a canvas that responds to thought and intention, then we're not sinners in need of saving. We're creators in need of remembering. This idea fills people with energy, with purpose. It shifts them from passive believers to active participants in their spiritual lives. And that's a beautiful thing. That's where the joy truly begins. Let's look at an example. Take the case of a woman named Lara, a former religious school teacher in Italy. For years, she taught the conventional doctrines of the church with passion, but deep down, she felt something was missing. It wasn't until she stumbled upon the Nag Hammadi texts, specifically the Gospel of Thomas, that everything changed. She said it felt like a key turning in a lock inside her heart. Suddenly, prayer wasn't just ritual. It became communion. Meditation wasn't just stillness. It became electricity. She began seeing the teachings of Jesus not as commandments, but as codes. Instructions for waking up, not kneeling down. This didn't make her less devoted. It made her more alive. And she's not alone. There are countless people around the world who, upon encountering these once-hidden teachings, report a surge of vitality, like a forgotten language of the soul had finally returned. That's what the Vatican can't stop. That's what secrecy can't contain. The joy of rediscovery is louder than censorship. The surprise of truth returning after being buried is one of the most exhilarating emotions a human being can feel. And right now, it's spreading through books, conversations, dreams, and intuition. People are no longer waiting to be handed the truth. They're reaching for it, reconstructing it, feeling it rise from within. The Vatican may hold the vault, but we hold the vibration. And once that vibration begins to rise, no amount of stone, secrecy, or surveillance can hold it back. It moves through us like music, ancient, familiar, and new all at once. This is spiritual momentum, and it's only just beginning. There's a special kind of joy that comes not from learning something new, but from remembering something ancient, something that had been inside you all along. It's a quiet, steady joy. Not the burst of a surprise, but the warmth of realization. It's the moment you stop looking outside for validation and start seeing the divine reflection in your own soul. That's the feeling many people describe when they finally encounter teachings that were once hidden or denied, truths about human potential, consciousness, and spiritual power that had been erased or rebranded for centuries. These teachings don't just educate, they restore. And with that restoration comes something even more beautiful: pride. Not pride in the ego-driven sense, but the deep, grounded pride of spiritual self-worth. Because what's more empowering than realizing you were never broken to begin with? Let's pause here and reflect on what has been kept from us. For hundreds of years, religious institutions told us that we were inherently sinful, flawed, and weak. That salvation came only through obedience. That only those in robes or authority could truly understand God. That we were not worthy to approach the divine directly. But what if that narrative was never true? What if the real teachings, those that still sit behind the locked doors of the Vatican, taught something radically different? What if they said, "You are divine too?" That Jesus wasn't a distant figure to worship, but a mirror, reflecting what's possible when a human awakens fully to their spiritual nature? Now imagine the pride of rediscovering that. There's sorrow too, of course. Because once you realize that you've been living in a cage of half-truths, there's a sadness that follows. A mourning for all the years spent doubting your worth. A grief for how many generations passed without knowing their sacredness. But then comes the turning point. Because once you remember, you cannot unremember. You rise with new eyes. And that shift, no matter how quiet or personal, is revolutionary. Many scholars who've studied the fragments of recovered Gnostic texts, the Dead Sea Scrolls, or even suppressed Eastern manuscripts describe the same feeling, a deep sense of returning, of reclaiming, of rising from beneath centuries of dust and fear. One powerful example comes from a man named Elias, a Syrian Christian scholar who fled religious persecution in the early 2000s. After settling in France, he gained limited access to early Christian manuscripts that had been digitized by private libraries. Among them, he found teachings that completely changed his faith. One passage described Jesus as encouraging his disciples not to fear death, not to bow to religious authority, but to know the light within and walk by it, for it is older than time. Elias wept, not from fear or loss, but from the relief of recognition. It felt like I had finally come home to something my soul never forgot, he wrote in his journal. That's the quiet joy of truth returning. And the pride that follows? It's not loud. It doesn't need to be. It shows up in how someone walks, how they speak, how they choose to live. It's the pride of someone who knows they are not small, that they were never meant to shrink to fit the rules of an institution, that the breath in their lungs is sacred and their thoughts are not sins, but sparks of divine intelligence. This is why the idea of hidden archives stirs such powerful emotion. It's not just about dusty pages, it's about stolen identity, suppressed dignity. And once you begin to reclaim that identity, you walk differently. We see it in spiritual seekers across the globe. People leaving rigid institutions, not to abandon faith, but to deepen it. People combining science, energy, and consciousness into their practice. Not because it's trendy, but because it makes sense. People feeling proud not to follow blindly, but to seek truth fearlessly. And maybe that's the greatest hidden treasure of all. Not the texts, not the relics, not even the forbidden knowledge, but the awakening that comes because of the search. The pride that grows when you stop being afraid of your own light. We were told to fear knowledge, but in truth, knowledge, real knowledge, gives us back to ourselves. There's a moment in every awakening when thought becomes movement. You read a line, hear a whisper, watch a story unfold that shakes something inside you. And at first, it's a quiet ripple, just curiosity. But over time, that ripple grows. It builds energy, and eventually, it becomes a force you can't ignore. That's the moment you act. And for many people learning about the secrets possibly locked away in the Vatican archives, that moment is now. But let's be honest, it's not always comfortable. With every discovery comes a shadow. With every question comes a consequence. That's the part many forget. Seeking truth isn't just enlightening, it's terrifying. Because the truth, if it's real, demands change. And change is never safe. That's the paradox of spiritual awakening. You feel joy, but also unease. You feel motivated, but also uncertain. You're excited to grow, but afraid of what you'll leave behind. And that's okay. In fact, it's necessary. The Vatican's secrecy, its centuries-long suppression of spiritual texts, alternative histories, and metaphysical wisdom, isn't just about preserving doctrine. It's about control. Control through fear. Control through silence. Control through the idea that asking deeper questions is dangerous. And yet here we are, asking anyway. Because people are starting to realize that silence doesn't mean safety. Ignorance doesn't mean innocence. And tradition doesn't always mean truth. Take the story of Matteo, a theology student from Argentina. He entered seminary at 19, full of passion and unquestioning devotion. But during his studies, he stumbled upon references to the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, fragments suggesting she was more than a passive follower, that she may have been a spiritual teacher, a leader, possibly the closest one to Jesus. He brought it up in a class discussion. The room went cold. Later, his instructor pulled him aside and said, "Some truths aren't meant to be explored. Some questions only lead to trouble." Matteo didn't argue. He didn't fight. He just nodded. But he never forgot that moment. Within a year, he left the seminary. Not because he lost faith, but because he found it in a new form. A fire had started. Not a fire of rebellion, but of real curiosity. One he couldn't extinguish. And now, he travels Latin America teaching spiritual workshops, not to oppose religion, but to explore the truths that lie beneath it. That's what courage looks like. It's not about attacking institutions or throwing away tradition. It's about standing at the edge of the known and stepping forward anyway. And more people are doing it. They're learning that fear is not the enemy, it's the invitation. That worry is not weakness, it's the price of growth. Because to awaken is to let go of comfort, to step outside of what you were told and trust what you feel. And that feeling is spreading. When we hear stories of ancient civilizations that may have held advanced knowledge, when we learn of possible extraterrestrial contact recorded in scripture, when we discover how many sacred texts have been labeled heretical just because they empowered the individual instead of the institution, we're not just learning history. We're seeing ourselves. We're seeing the potential we've been taught to forget. And that realization is energizing. It doesn't matter if you're a scholar, a mystic, or a curious soul who's never picked up a religious text in your life. If you've ever looked at the stars and wondered, if you've ever felt that quiet nudge that says there's more than this, then you're already part of this movement. The fear? It's real. But so is the fire. And once that fire is lit, it's only a matter of time before it becomes action. It starts small. Reading more. Asking more. Trusting your gut. Connecting with others who feel the same. And eventually, it becomes momentum, personal, collective, unstoppable. The Vatican can guard its walls, but it can't guard your spirit. And your spirit is waking up. Not in chaos, but in clarity. Not to destroy, but to discover. Because truth isn't just something you uncover. It's something you become. There's a strange moment in every spiritual journey, a moment when the joy of awakening collides with the weight of realization. It's the moment you understand that the stories you've been told your entire life may have been incomplete, that what you were taught to revere might have been filtered, edited, and packaged, that sacred knowledge might have been hidden not to protect you, but to protect power. And when that hits, it's a jolt. Some people feel disoriented, even betrayed. Others experience a wave of panic. If the version of history I've known isn't the whole truth, then what else have I accepted without question? But what follows, if you stay with that discomfort, is something extraordinary, a deep, fulfilling joy. Because beneath the shock and fear, there's another voice rising. A quiet, inner voice that says, I knew it. Not intellectually, not from books, but from the heart. You knew that you were meant for more than obedience. That the divine wasn't something outside of you, locked in cathedrals or rituals, but something inside you, whispering every day through intuition, love, and inner knowing. That joy? It's sacred pride. Not the pride of ego, but of essence. A joy that says, I remember now. That's what many people describe when they discover suppressed texts or ancient teachings. Ones that speak of human divinity, the power of the soul, the illusion of separation, and the real message of Jesus as a teacher of inner transformation rather than institutional obedience. It's the joy of coming home. To something you never knew you lost, but missed deeply. Let's take the story of Shira, an artist and former theology professor in Israel. For most of her life, she taught within the boundaries of sanctioned religious doctrine. But when a friend introduced her to a translation of the Gospel of Thomas, something shifted. This text didn't speak of sin and punishment. It spoke of inner light. It said, if you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. That one line shattered her foundation and built a new one. I cried, she said in a public lecture, not because I felt deceived, but because I felt free. That was the voice I had always heard in my soul, but was taught to silence. Today, Shira blends art, mysticism, and sacred geometry into her workshops, helping others reconnect with their own divine spark. And she's not alone. All around the world, people are rediscovering what was once hidden. And they're doing it not out of rebellion, but out of reverence. Because true reverence doesn't fear questions, it invites them. That's the kind of pride we're talking about. Not blind loyalty to a structure, but reverence for truth even when it's inconvenient. Especially when it's inconvenient. The fear, of course, still lingers. What will happen if I talk about this publicly? Will I be ridiculed? Cast out? Misunderstood? But every time one person chooses truth over comfort, something amazing happens. Someone else finds the courage to do the same. We see it in the growing communities of spiritual seekers, mystics, open-minded scholars, and everyday people who've simply had enough of being told what to believe. And when they speak, they don't sound angry. They sound clear. Because the joy that comes from remembering who you are is louder than the fear of what might happen. We were taught to fear God. But what if the real message was, God is not separate from you? We were told to confess our sins. But what if the true invitation was to recognize our wholeness? We were warned against exploring forbidden knowledge. But what if the most forbidden thing of all was unconditional self-worth? This is what's at stake in the hidden archives, the missing gospels, the spiritual wisdom buried for centuries. It's not just about dusty scrolls. It's about your birthright. And when people begin to realize that, they don't become arrogant, they become luminous. They stand taller, speak softer, live more intentionally. Because they've remembered something ancient and sacred. Divinity is not earned. It is remembered. That is the joy no institution can suppress. And that's the pride no doctrine can take away. The question is no longer, what are they hiding? We already know. Whether it's the lost teachings of Jesus, records of ancient civilizations, or evidence of higher intelligences, the Vatican archives represent something far greater than locked doors and classified documents. They represent a global choice. Because this story isn't just about what's buried beneath Rome. It's about you. The deeper you go into these mysteries, the more one truth becomes impossible to ignore. What's been kept hidden for centuries is not just historical. It's personal. It's about your consciousness, your freedom, your ability to connect with the divine without needing permission. And that truth is both exhilarating and terrifying. Because once you realize that divinity lies within you, the world you once trusted begins to crumble. That can be overwhelming. There's a reason fear kicks in at this stage. You begin to ask, if everything I've believed was shaped by someone else's agenda, how do I even begin to rebuild? But fear isn't the end. It's the beginning. It means you're standing at the threshold of awakening. And you're not alone. People everywhere are waking up. Not through conspiracy, but through courage. Not to rebel, but to remember. They're starting to look beyond the surface. They're starting to realize that truth isn't handed down, it's earned through inquiry. That real faith isn't about blind obedience. It's about trust in your own divine compass. And that's where the real danger lies, not in the Vatican's secrets, but in how many of us were taught not to ask. You were never meant to be a passive believer. You were meant to be an explorer of truth, a keeper of wisdom, a sovereign spiritual being. That is why they buried the most powerful knowledge. Not because it wasn't true, but because it made you powerful. And now that power is calling you back. So here's the moment of truth. You have two paths before you. One is the path of comfort, believing what you were told, trusting the sanitized version of history, obeying without questioning. The other is the path of awakening, asking uncomfortable questions, searching through the cracks, and risking everything to find something real. It won't be easy. You'll lose people. You'll challenge your own identity. You might even feel lost at times. But what you'll gain is priceless. Clarity, purpose, inner authority, a connection to the divine that no institution can give or take away. You'll begin to see that the greatest wisdom isn't hidden in a vault. It's in your own awareness, in the way you perceive, in the way you live, in the way you love. Because the truth was never lost. It was hidden in plain sight, buried beneath rituals, rewritten scriptures, and centuries of spiritual amnesia. But always there, waiting for you to wake up. And if you're watching this now, you already have. So what comes next? You choose. You choose whether to stay asleep or go deeper, whether to wait for permission or claim your freedom, whether to believe the story you were given or write your own. And if you're ready to go deeper, to uncover what can't be said aloud, to connect with others walking this same path, we've created a space for that. Insights Academy. Our free newsletter is where we dive beyond the surface, sharing insights, forbidden texts, and decoded truths. It's not about convincing you of anything. It's about reminding you of everything you already feel. For a limited time, when you sign up, you'll receive a free digital copy of the Kibbun, a guidebook filled with tools, teachings, and symbols to help you navigate this awakening with clarity and confidence. This isn't a sales pitch. It's a doorway. Because while the Vatican may control its archives, it cannot control your will to remember. So ask yourself now, will you keep believing the world as it's been told to you? Or will you begin to uncover the one that's been kept from you? The truth is not something given. It is something taken by those brave enough to look.